everyone. Thanks for joining Matt Manocherian and I on Off the Charts today. I'm Mark Simon. We're going to go in a little bit of a different direction, with February being Black History Month. First, we're going to talk to Jeremi Duru, law professor and author, about the current state of black coaches and executives in the sport. Then we're going to talk to Joe Horrigan. Joe's an advisor at the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He's held many roles there, been there for more than 40 years, a great football historian. He's going to acquaint us with the past and how the Hall of Fame tells the story of black football players and coaches. We welcome in civil rights lawyer and Jeremi Duru. We had Jeremi on last year. He's a professor of sports law, the author of multiple books, including Advancing the Ball, Race, Reformation, and the Quest for Equal Coaching Opportunity in the NFL. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Mark, great to be here.
We asked this last year. We'll ask it again this year. What is the state of the league as far as the hiring of black coaches and GMs?
Well, I'd say it's certainly more fraught this year than it was last year. I don't know that the numbers are terribly different. As a macro matter, it was discouraging last year, it's discouraging this year. The big difference, of course, Mark, is the lawsuit that's been filed by Brian Flores against the league and its clubs alleging racial discrimination in employment. And that, I think, will turn out to be, we'll look back on it as a game changer. It is historically rare that an individual sues a professional sports franchise for racial discrimination, and even more rare that that individual is able to still work in the league, which we see Brian Flores is able to do because the Pittsburgh Steelers picked him up. But I would say fraught. We're hoping for positivity, hopefully that out of this lawsuit grows a better and stronger and more equitable league. But definitely the tension is high.
I want to come back to the lawsuit in one sec. There was one question I wanted to get to before that. The difference between the number of black coaches and the number of black GMs in the league, there's an imbalance there, and I'm curious how we reconcile the difference.
Yeah, it's interesting. It may just be the ebb and flow. I don't know if there's anything about one position or the other that makes clubs more or less equitable with respect to hiring. I should say that for the bulk of the last 20 years, there have been more head coaches of color than GMs of color. And now we've flipped that a little bit. But of course, in the aggregate altogether, the numbers are disproportionately low.
Now, you mentioned the Brian Flores lawsuit. And I guess the first thing that I would ask, for those that aren't familiar, Brian Flores suing the NFL, the Giants, the Broncos, and the Dolphins for damages for racial discrimination and changes to coach hiring, retention, and pay transparency practices. There were some interesting things that came out publicly. You get certain headlines that come out right away, like the Bill Belichick texts, for example, Belichick texting the wrong Brian about the situation, which made Brian Flores aware of what was going on with the Giants. What do you make of this lawsuit on the whole?
As I said earlier, it's a groundbreaking lawsuit because of the fact that it was filed. The underlying evidence, league-wide evidence of double standards for coaches of color is not surprising. Shouldn't surprise anybody who's watching the space. Flores identified that black coaches have an average tenure in the league of 2.5 years, whereas white coaches have 3.5-year average tenure. After a winning season, 25% of the time, black coaches are terminated. For white coaches, it's 6% of the time. Black coaches have a harder time getting a second job. And so these are statistics that Flores lays out in the suit, but anyone who's watching the space knows that these statistics exist. They've been, these sorts of double standards have been existing for decades. So that part isn't surprising. The actual suit, as I said, is surprising. And I will say that it is a strong suit. Where it will end up, Mark, it's hard to say. Litigation is pockmarked with, you just never know what's going to happen in litigation. But it's a strong complaint. It's not something that was just put together over the course of a weekend. And I think Flores and his team are prepared to go the distance if it comes to that. But of course, there's a possibility, as there always is in litigation, that there could be a settlement sooner than later. And that would be interesting as well, particularly because, as you mentioned, Mark, he's seeking monetary damages, unspecified monetary damages, but also systemic relief. He is seeking programmatic change that the NFL, if he won, would have to implement. They would make the likelihood of diversity among decision makers at clubs and diversity in ownership higher. And so any sort of settlement, I imagine, Flores would require have some of that programmatic relief in it.
Let's walk through just the initial happenings of the case. What's going to happen here? Because amateur here, who just watches these sorts of things unfold on TV or reads about them in articles online, the legal discovery process is always an interesting one. And you have to think that there are some things in here beyond text from Bill Belichick that are pretty damning that teams aren't going to want to be seen, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so the discovery process that you mentioned is, of course, a process during which one side gets to receive all the relevant documents, emails, information from the other side. And it can be very illuminating, as you point out. There could be all sorts of information that's not public yet that the defendants would not want to make public. The issue is that you don't get to discovery until you get past what's called a motion to dismiss, a 12B6 motion to dismiss, which defendants reflexively file, basically saying this is not a claim for which relief can be granted. So Flores will have to get past that motion to dismiss to get to discovery. And so one of the next big decision nodes in the case will be a court determining whether indeed Flores can even get into discovery.
Can anyone else join in on the case on his side?
Yeah, so he brought a class action case. And a class action case is one in which you, the named plaintiff, Flores, is suing on behalf of a class of similarly situated individuals. So other people of color who are current or former executives or coaches in the National Football League. And so if it's the case that he is able to move forward with the class, people join the class, then, there's strength in numbers. And I think it strengthens all of their cases and certainly Flores' case. If the court determines that he cannot move forward with the class, and that can be determined for a number of reasons, the court can conclude that there just aren't enough people who are interested in coming forward and joining the class. The court can conclude that there are not common issues of fact and law for a number of reasons. It could be the case that there's not class certification. And if there's not class certification, if he cannot move forward as a class, then it will be just him and his individual case involving the Giants and the Dolphins and the Broncos and the league.
Would someone like Eric Bieniemy be someone who could join the case?
Yeah, absolutely. If he chose to, he certainly could.
What are the chances that the case could get dismissed?
It's hard to put percentages on it. It's hard to guess on it, Mark. There is certainly a chance, and it's not a marginal chance. I mean, it is tough to get past motion to dismiss and employment discrimination lawsuits as a general matter, and it'll be tough in this context. So I can't put a percentage on it, but I think, it's possible he could get past the motion to dismiss, but it's also very possible that he loses at the motion to dismiss stage. And it is also possible, as I mentioned earlier, that both parties can opt for an off-ramp out of litigation into mediation or arbitration or settlement talks that might result in resolution. Doesn't mean that the parties ultimately go to the mat.
Roger Goodell sent a memo to all 32 teams saying that hiring rates for minorities are unacceptable. And he said they're going to do things like, quote, solicit input. Is there a reason to think that that's more than just empty language?
I think there is. I think that it may not appear to be the case because of the fraught context in which we exist now. But I believe the league, and when I say the league, I mean the league front office, the commissioner's office, and the executive vice presidents and senior vice presidents up there are committed to racial diversity and equal opportunity. If you look at Goodell's own staff, his reports, it's quite diverse. So I think the commitment is there on the league side. I think the problem is with the clubs, and not all the clubs, but many of the clubs that don't seem serious about pursuing equal opportunity, that don't seem to perhaps place the value on diversity that some other clubs and entities place on it, that perhaps effectuate runarounds, the Rooney Rule, during their interview processes and engage in sham interviews. The clubs is where we need to focus, and the league's failure is not coming down on the clubs when the clubs have flouted the rule in spirit and text.
With that in mind, on our baseball podcast, we talked to Jasmine Dunston, the only Black director of minor league operations. Her team president, Ken Williams of the White Sox, has been outspoken about how awful minority hiring practices are in baseball. And he actually was the one who engineered the hiring of Jasmine Dunston and brought her to the team in a significant role. There are 7 Black general managers in the NFL right now. Is there anyone who's shown a willingness to do this sort of thing in the NFL and I guess commit to hiring a diverse workforce?
We'll see. You mentioned that there's 7. There are a couple of them who are brand new. But, certainly there's some who have shown commitment. I'll name, Martin Mayhew was one out of Washington who's got a long record of both excellence in the league, but also commitment on these issues. And then, of course, moving away from GMs, but just going to organizations, you've got to look, I mentioned before the Steelers, you've got to look at the Steelers. The step that Art Rooney, the second president there, the owner, I should say there, and Mike Tomlin took in hiring Brian Flores, that's not a timid step. Flores is suing their club and every other club in the league. And you can only imagine that there are other owners out there who were furious that the Steelers would make the hire. But the Steelers did what they believed was right and what I believe is right. And they should be applauded for it. And moreover, they have made themselves better because nobody in the NFL community believes that Flores is a bad coach. Nobody. Everybody respects him as a coach. He should be a head coach. So for them to be able to bring him in to work with the linebackers and with the defense generally, it's just a win for them. They've made themselves better by doing that.
Is the NFL doing anything? I know that they have a program for coaches, if I'm not mistaken, to try and foster growth in that area. Is the NFL doing anything to grow the next generation of executives? The new Vikings general manager, for example, went to Princeton. Not everyone has that luxury. I know that in the other sports, we don't see a lot of Black men and women working in team analytics departments. Is the NFL doing anything to try and help in those areas?
It is. It's got a program called the Nunn-Wooten Fellowship Program, and it's named after Bill Nunn, the extraordinary Hall of Fame entrant now for the Pittsburgh Steelers, who did extraordinary things with their scouting department in the 70s and 80s and moving forward. And John Wooten, the former chairman of the Fritz Pollard Alliance, who was an extraordinary exec himself with the Cowboys and the Eagles and the Ravens. Both of these men are African American, and the program exists to get people of color into the personnel pipeline. So it's quite similar to the Bill Walsh Fellowship, which you are referencing, that exists with respect to coaches of color.
Jeremi Duru, our guest, are you working on anything in this area yourself?
So I'm working actually on the sports law treatise, a survey across sports law with a gentleman named Tim Davis, a professor at Wake Forest University School of Law. And boy, it's been a bear. We've been working on this for close to 2 years now. And hopefully we're going to press this spring and hopefully it'll be out in the fall. So kind of a across the board guide to sports law should be coming out from Davis and Duru.
Nice. People can certainly check that out. We'll reference it in the show notes. Jeremi Duru, civil rights attorney, author of Advancing the Ball, Race, Reformation, and the Quest for Equal Coaching Opportunity in the NFL. Thank you for joining us.
Always a pleasure to be with you, Mark.
We wanted to do a segment for Black History Month that was educational in nature. Joe Horrigan is the senior advisor to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He's been associated with the Hall of Fame for more than 40 years, holding a large number of roles, helping oversee the museum, the Hall of Fame selection process, and communications. He's also been the executive director. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
This is intended to be a history lesson, so let's begin a good ways back here, and that means going back 100 years or so. Can you share the origin story of Black players and coaches in the NFL with Fritz Pollard and Bobby Marshall? And I suppose that means sharing their exit story too.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that both Fritz Pollard and Bobby Marshall were playing professional football 1 year before the NFL was even founded. It sounds crazy, but most people associate the NFL with pro football. I'm thinking that there wasn't pro football before the NFL, but there definitely was. There just was no league. There was independent pro teams. Fritz was playing with the Akron Pros, and Bobby was with the Minnesota franchise that was later, as was Akron, added as members of the National Football League in 1920. So they both had 1 year under their belt before they joined the NFL. The most significant nature, I think, is Fritz Pollard, who had a Hall of Fame career with the pros and other teams. And as a halfback, went to Brown and played in the 1916 Rose Bowl, was a star in that game. And they were just one of two Black players in the NFL at that time. Now, that's not to say that the NFL was the massive success and the so well known that this was, earth-shattering news. It really wasn't. In pro football, we had some black players that played before the NFL, going all the way back to 1904, the first being Charles Follis, who played for the Shelby Athletic Club here in Shelby, Ohio. In any case, Fritz, as I say, was the best known because of his college career at Brown. And not only did he break that glass ceiling in the NFL with the first year of the league's existence, but the following year, he was a player coach. He was the head coach of the team, which obviously made him the first black head coach in NFL history. Now, you have to understand what a coach was in those days. He was not a sideline coach like we have today. Coaches were generally either player coaches, or if there was a sideline coach, it was more of a titular honor because it was the on-play calling. You couldn't call plays from the sideline. So you had to call plays from the huddle. And often that fell on the shoulders of the captain. Well, in this case, Fritz was not the captain, but he was named the coach. And as he would explain later to me many, many years ago, that it was because the owners of the Akron Pros were so impressed with Brown University's play that they felt that he could teach the Akron Pros those plays and coach them. So that was a big milestone for him. But life was not simple in pro football or any sport for a black athlete at that time, and that was the case with Fritz as well. He had a teammate in 1921 of probably a better known name than Fritz in later years that went on to distinguish himself as a great orator and singer, and played at Rutgers. And the two of them, were really, if you will, a kind of a main attraction for pro football, which they needed at the time. So that was kind of the early years. I didn't mention his name. Paul Robeson.
Who was that?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Paul Robeson. I'm assuming everybody knows this, but no, Paul Robeson, who made a splash in the NFL for 2 years. But he was really, pro football was not looked at as going to be something of a career. Although Fritz did make a career of it, very few black players did in those early years.
So, Joe, I'm sorry, but you're already kind of blowing my mind. I've gone through my history books. I love football and have been studying the sport as long as I can remember. And I look back in all the pre-NFL pro scores where you see games that were either like 0-0 because nobody could move the ball, or it was like 70-0 a lot of the time. A lot of Midwestern teams playing against each other. Are you saying that all the way back then, football was actually integrated?
Yeah, all the way back to 1904. So there was, when we say integrated.
So it became unintegrated at some point? Or
Well, I make this argument. While I say it was integrated, I would hardly call it integrated. There were very isolated incidences of black players playing professional sports or professional football in this case. The integration part really, we're talking into the 40s before I would even call the sport integrated. There were isolated incidences where specific player, maybe two, would be on a team at the same time.
It sounds like he's really good. We'll take him on our team, but otherwise we're not interested.
Yeah, you had to be special, and it had to be. And Fritz Pollard was one that actually told me this because of the early NFL pro players, of which there were 13 between 1920 and 1933. Some for as little as a season, and others for a few years. Most of them were invited, if you will, to the NFL by Fritz Pollard. They would talk to each other and say, "Hey, is this a team where I could play? Will I be able to live in this community? What do you think?" And Fritz had played in some of these with these teams, Milwaukee, Akron, out and non-league teams up in Pennsylvania, Gilberton, Pennsylvania, in the coal mining regions. And Fritz was kind of a recruiter in the sense that he told these few black players that were playing collegiate football, it would be, probably worth their while to try it here at this city that, management was okay to work for and so on. So Fritz was a bit of a, beyond his own contribution of being pioneer, he brought other players to the league as well.
What allowed black players to break through and fully integrate the sport?
There was a lot of things that contributed to that, not the least of which was World War II. During the war, there was a manpower shortage. The National Football League between 1932 and 46 had no black players at all. There was what people refer to as a gentleman's agreement not to, though no one can ever really come up with any real physical evidence to suggest that it was formal. But in fact, it existed. But there were so few in the NFL that for them to disappear from the rosters was not a noticeable adjustment. There were only a few at a time. So During that period, there were no black players, 32 to 46. After World War II, there was a glut of returning athletes from the service ranks. They had been either drafted or enlisted during the war. And that gave an opportunity for a new rival league to start called the All-America Football Conference. And one of the entries in that league, we were the Cleveland Browns. That's where they began, was in that rival league. And Paul Brown was the coach. Paul Brown had black players at the collegiate level as a coach, in the high school level as a coach, and in service football at Great Lakes. He had Marion Motley, a Canton resident, who he then invited to play with the Browns in 46, along with Bill Willis, who had played for him at Ohio State. So, Paul Brown, it was nothing new to him. Throughout his coaching career, he had black players. So he, in the All-America Football Conference, he wasn't breaking a barrier because they hadn't played yet, but he did sign those two players in 46. And then over in the National Football League, the Cleveland Rams were relocating from Cleveland. They were the 1945 NFL champs, but they were moving to Los Angeles, where they became the Los Angeles Rams. And to play in the Los Angeles Coliseum, they were forced by the city fathers and by the black newspapers in Los Angeles to, if you're going to play in this civic facility, you're going to have to integrate your team. And reluctantly, they did so by signing two former UCLA stars, Kenny Washington and Woody Strode, both of whom had been out of pro football, or been out of football, major football, for a number of years. They'd been playing semi-pro ball. So that kind of broke the ice. And, people like to say that's when the NFL became integrated. Well, they became reintegrated, if you will. But I caution to say that was just the beginning. The door got, cracked open. It wasn't swung open yet. So it was going to be a slow process even from that point on.
Well, here we are, and it's amazing what you say, because the league is now, I believe, 70% black as far as the players go. Mm-hmm. But there's been a ton of conversation this offseason that sprouts from Brian Flores' situation, and really years and years of frustration of, despite the player pool having changed, a lot of the management not having followed the same ranks, including head coaches. I'm curious because you say things like a gentleman's agreement, and it makes me think it's so disgusting and from such a long time ago. Mm-hmm. And yet here we are in 2022. I'm curious, is there something we can learn from the past as it applies to the current situation? Or really, I'm just looking for what's your kind of take on the current situation is.
Well, there's been so many changes. There's been so many positive changes, but yet at the same time, there remains these barriers that seemed to never go away. For many years, there were no black quarterbacks in the National Football League. My good friend James Harris, Shaq Harris, was the first black quarterback to start a home opener for a pro football team, and he started in 1969 with the Buffalo Bills. The first time a black man has started at quarterback in the National Football League in a home opener. That's unbelievable. That's certainly in my lifetime. I can tell you it was in my lifetime because I was the ball boy for the team, and I've known Shaq since that day. So, things are slow to change, and that is just a good example of it. But there were what they called stacking back in the 60s when they eventually did kind of open the floodgates again. Just like I was talking about the All-America Football Conference, history teaches us something. There was another rival league, the American Football League, who were anxious to find the best players they could to compete with the National Football League. And they went to HBCUs. And this was something that was not happening in the NFL just yet. Very, very slow, a couple of instances. But the AFL embraced the HBCUs and signed some great players to contracts in the American Football League, just out of necessity for good players and to compete with the NFL, much the way what All-America Football Conference was doing. So you mentioned, do you learn anything from history? I think you learn competition will breed, I don't want to call it equality, but it will expedite equality when you have competitive reasons to open your minds and become a little more colorblind. So I'm hoping that's, answers your question a little bit, but it's the same way where it was the black quarterback. There was, there weren't black officials. There weren't, and still aren't enough black head coaches. The black head coaching from Fritz Pollard in 1921 and the second one wasn't until Art Shell in the 80s. So, that's not acceptable. And since then, with the Rooney Rule, when that first got implemented, I believe when Paul Tagliabue, who was commissioner at the time of the Rooney Rule and worked very closely with Dan Rooney on developing that. I think when Paul retired, there were 14 black head coaches that had gone through as a result of the Rooney Rule. It seemed to work early on. And then all of a sudden, I don't know what the dynamics were, but the shift occurred that the rule was circumvented by a lot of teams, just going through the motions of interviewing black candidates, but not hiring coaches. So it lost some of the bite that the teeth should have been tighter grip on the Rooney Rule enforcement than probably has happened over the years.
We're hearing how you tell the story of the black athlete in professional football and in professional football coaching. How does the Hall of Fame tell the story?
Well, we tell a story, and this is an interesting thing because, we're a museum, and I think that a museum's role is to tell stories. And sometimes you have to tell stories that make you feel a little uncomfortable, because if you're not uncomfortable, you're probably not telling the whole story. But we, 2 years ago, decided to working for a number of years with the Black College Football Hall of Fame that the aforementioned Shaq Harris and Doug Williams founded back in 2010. In 2016, as a member of their board of advisors, I was put on a committee to help them find a permanent home for the Black College Football Hall of Fame. They were really operating as a foundation and an annual enshrinement ceremony, but they needed a physical home. So after looking at a lot of well-intended people's proposals in terms of where it might relocate, it became pretty apparent to me that none of them were self-sustaining. And I kind of threw out an idea. I wasn't quite sure what the reaction would be, but we threw out the idea to have the Black College Football Hall of Fame housed here at the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And I'll kind of go into the story of why I thought that was a good fit. But first, it required James and Doug to say that that would be a good idea, which they did. And then I brought the idea back here to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And then President and CEO David Baker, he embraced the idea, which was important. And then he took it to our board and they embraced the idea. So long story short, the Pro Football Hall of Fame is now the home of the Black College Football Hall of Fame as well. And why that makes sense is that it was my argument that this was the circle of the development of the game. This was the story that wasn't told. We take a lot of bows for breaking barriers, like Fritz Pollard becoming a head coach, Art Shell becoming a head coach, or HBCU players coming into the NFL. But we don't tell the full story about why they weren't here before. It was the incomplete story. So we felt that the HBCU story that is a parallel universe to not only pro football, but to college football, it tells the story about how since 1892, there had been black college football being played in this country, but they weren't going beyond the black colleges. They weren't being the players that played at black colleges weren't invited to play at white colleges and universities. And when they had postgraduate football, they weren't invited to play in the NFL or pro football. So we felt that we needed to tell that story before we take too many bows for the successes that the league and college football have had since.
That's really fascinating, Joe. I'm curious if there's something, since kind of we're running out of time here, is there anything that would just shock me? I'm sure you come across people all the time that just don't know anything about the old history of the NFL, that it seems so obvious to you. Is there anything that just when you tell it to people about kind of the way things were or the history of the game that people just don't realize and are blown away by?
Yeah, I'll tell you a quick, and I'll apologize. I'll try to make it as quick as I can. Branch Rickey, who signed Jackie Robinson to a contract, Major League Baseball contract in 1947. That's 1 year after the NFL had signed Kenny Washington and Woody Strode, and the AAFC, the All-America Football Conference, had signed Marion Motley and Bill Willis. But Branch Rickey pro football actually had an impact on Branch Rickey, and that Branch Rickey became an owner of one of the All-America Football Conference franchises, the Brooklyn Dodgers football team, not baseball team. And he had watched Marion Motley and Bill Willis play successfully in the All-America Football Conference. And he is actually quoted as having been told, or having said in an interview, that having watched Bill Willis and Marion Motley play in a contact sport like, quote, gentlemen, that he was given the courage to make the move that he'd been contemplating with Jackie Robinson. So it was this exposure to seeing black athletes in a contact sport that Branch Rickey was finally motivated to make that final step and bring Jackie Robinson up the next year into Major League Baseball.
And with that, is there a player, coach, otherwise a black player, a black coach, who's kind of like a forgotten person in pro football history that's really important to the story of the black player and the black coach?
Well, there's so many, and I think in every case there's a role that has been played. That all the people, no matter whether it was for a game or for a season, that contributed to the overall eventual success and the opening of the floodgates of college football into pro football with people of color. But one player I particularly like telling the story is Duke Slater, who played in the 1920s and 30s with the Chicago Cardinals. And Duke was a fantastic player, but he was a lineman. He was a tackle, and that got him little enough attention. But he had a 9-year career, which was unheard of for most players in the National Football League at that time, but certainly for a black player. And one of the great games of all time in those early years was when Ernie Nevers scored 6 touchdowns in a single game, scoring all 40 points. He kicked extra points too for his team. And his lead blocker for the whole game was this Duke Slater. But, had it been a white player, perhaps he might have been better known for his outstanding play that he had not only on that day, but throughout his career. But he was honored last year with induction to the Hall of Fame, long, long overdue. I always kind of talk a little bit about Duke, the sense that he played in a position that didn't get a lot of attention, but also I'm sure the color of the skin kept him out of the headlines as well.
And to wrap, just give us, I think, a good number of our listeners who've probably been to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, but you just give us your sales pitch for people who haven't necessarily been there, like myself.
Well, shame on you. My sales pitch is this. Look, I've literally been here 43 plus years, and I find things, that that I haven't seen before. Not only, we have an archives here that I have access to, obviously, but the story of pro football is an ongoing story. Every day, every week, there's something new, and we try to mirror that at the Pro Football Hall of Fame. We go all the way back to 1892 when the first documented case of professionalism occurred. It's also the same year that black college football began. But we try to tell the whole story, and that's the key. And we make every effort to go back and even re-examine stories that we thought to be, 100% on the spot. But, evidence may change that every now and then, as was the case with a lot of the research we did on African-American pioneers. So, yeah, I guess my pitch is that if you haven't been here at all, certainly it's all new. But if you've even been here before on many occasions, there's always something new here.
Keep coming back. Joe Horrigan, thank you for taking the time to join us. Appreciate the work that you're doing.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
This wraps up this episode. For Jeremi Duru, Joe Horrigan, Matt Manocherian, and our producer Justin Stein, I'm Mark Simon. Thank you for listening to Off the Charts.